The courtroom was dead silent when my own father leaned over and whispered, "You're wrong, foolish soldier. You built it, but I own it." He actually laughed out loud, convinced his fake tears, and a rehearsed sob story, had just won him my $500,000 ranch. He had the gallery nodding along. He had his expensive lawyer smiling. What he didn't know was that in the military, we don't just fight battles, we keep receipts. And that certified black folder resting on my lap. It didn't just contain my deployment orders. It contained a federal document that was about to ruin his life. My name is Valerie Vance. I'm 34 years old, and for 15 years I have flown Black Hawk helicopters for the United States Army. I have logged 2,200 flight hours. I have pulled wounded soldiers out of places most people will never see on a map. I thought I understood pressure. I thought I understood danger. I did not understand betrayal, not really, not until I stood in a Bell County courthouse in October of last year, and watched my own father look me in the eye and lie under oath. But to explain how I got to that courtroom, I need to take you back 3 years, to a dusty stretch of land 40 minutes outside Killeen, Texas. I bought Vance Ridge in March of 2021. 90 acres, a renovated farmhouse with a green tin roof, 2 barns, and a stretch of creek that ran cold even in August. I paid $485,000 for it, financed through USAA, with a 20% down payment I had saved from 12 years of combat pay, hazard pay, and disciplined investing. I closed on the property on a Tuesday, and flew back to Fort Cavazos that same afternoon, because I had a training rotation the next morning. That was who I was. Work first. Land second. Everything else came after. I named it Vance Ridge because it was the first thing in my life that was entirely mine, purchased with money I earned, in my name alone, with a deed that had only one signature on it. Mine. My father, Garrison Vance, never saw it that way. Garrison is 61 years old. He ran a cattle supply business in Copperas Cove for almost 30 years, a business that had been sliding downhill since 2018, though he never admitted that to anyone, including himself. He is the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately starts calculating who owes him something. At Thanksgiving dinners, he used to introduce me to his friends as my daughter, she plays soldier for the government, and laugh like it was the funniest thing he'd ever said. He said it in 2019. He said it again in 2022, 2 weeks after I got back from a deployment to Kuwait. I stopped correcting him around 2020. You learn which battles are worth the ammunition. My mother passed in 2015. After that, my grandmother, Ruth Vance, moved in with my father in the house in Copperas Cove. Ruth was 86, sharp as a tack until her health started failing in early 2023. I loved her more than almost anyone alive. She was the only person in that family who ever called my job important instead of a phase. In January of 2023, I received deployment orders. 12 months, overseas, a classified logistics and aviation support assignment I'm still not permitted to discuss in detail. I remember standing in my kitchen at Vance Ridge, holding the paperwork, doing the math on my mortgage, my property taxes, and my grandmother's rising medical bills. I made a decision that night that I thought was responsible. I set up an $80,000 wire transfer, split into 4 quarterly payments, from my personal savings account directly into a joint account my father and grandmother shared, earmarked specifically for Ruth's home health care and medication costs. I had my financial power of attorney documents drawn up by a JAG attorney at Fort Cavazos before I left, naming my father as a limited caretaker of my grandmother's finances, and nothing more. I want you to remember that detail. Limited caretaker. Nothing more. I deployed on February 14, 2023. I would not step foot in the United States again for 361 days. During that year, I got maybe 6 phone calls with my father. Static-filled, for minutes long, the kind of calls where you say, "I love you" 3 times because you're not sure the connection will hold long enough to say it a 4th. He never once mentioned Vance Ridge. He never once mentioned money. He told me my grandmother was comfortable and well cared for. He told me not to worry. Ruth died on September 3, 2023. I was in a secure facility overseas, under a combat operations communication freeze that had been in place for 11 days. I did not find out until September 9. I did not get to say goodbye. I did not get to attend the funeral, which my father held on September 12, 6 days before my freeze was even lifted. I want to be honest with you about something. For a long time, I blamed myself for that. I still carry it, some days, like a weight strapped into the seat next to me. But grief, I've learned, is something people will use against you if you let them. And my father used it like a weapon before I even understood he was holding one. I landed back at Robert Gray Army Airfield on February 10, 2024. Sergeant First Class Danny Ruiz, one of my crew chiefs, and one of the only people who ever met me at Vance Ridge, offered to drive me straight home instead of to the barracks. I said yes. I hadn't seen my own front porch in 361 days, and I wanted, more than anything, to sit on those creaking wooden steps with a cup of black coffee and just breathe. We turned onto the gravel drive at 6:40 in the evening. The sun was already low, throwing long orange light across the pasture. And that's when I saw it. Cattle. Not mine. I don't run cattle at Vance Ridge, never have. 40, maybe 50 head, grazing on my land like they'd always been there. A new steel gate had been installed at the entrance to the north pasture, a gate I did not order and did not pay for. And on my front door, where my key had turned smoothly in the same lock for 3 years, there was a brand new brass deadbolt. My key didn't fit. I stood on my own porch in my own boots, holding a key that no longer opened my own front door, and for a moment I genuinely thought I had the wrong house. Danny thought so too. We actually walked the property line to check the road sign. Vance Ridge. Correct address. Correct fence posts. Correct creek. I called my father. It rang 4 times before he picked up. Dad, I said. There's cattle on my land. The locks are changed. What is going on? There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause a man takes when he's choosing his words instead of speaking the truth. Valerie, he said, and I remember the tone exactly, because it was the same tone he used when I was 17, and asked him why he'd sold my car without telling me. Calm. Almost bored. We need to talk. But not tonight. Come by the house tomorrow. I'm standing on my porch and I can't get into my own house, I said. We're talking now. It's not just your house anymore, sweetheart, he said. Get some rest. You've had a long deployment. He hung up. I stood there in the dark with my duffel bag still over my shoulder, my uniform still creased from the flight, and I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt since the worst days overseas. Not fear. Something colder than fear. Recognition. Danny drove me to a motel in Killeen that night. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at a cheap desk under a flickering lamp, and I did what 15 years of military training taught me to do when everything around you is on fire. I stopped reacting. And I started documenting. The next morning, February 11th, I drove to the Bell County Clerk's office. I pulled the current deed record on Vance Ridge. What I found made my hands go still on the counter. The deed had been amended. Filed on August 22, 2023, 3 weeks before my grandmother died, while I was under a communication freeze halfway across the world and legally incapable of contesting anything. The filing added a new name to the property record as co-trustee of the Vance family estate. My father's name. Attached to the filing was a notarized letter, allegedly signed by me, granting him shared decision-making authority over the ranch during my deployment. I did not sign that letter. I was not in the country. I was not, by any stretch of federal military record, physically capable of appearing before a notary in Bell County, Texas, on August 22, 2023. On that exact date, according to my deployment logs, I was 3,000 miles away, running a night logistics rotation that is documented, timestamped, and stored on a federal server that no civilian notary public could ever falsify. My father had forged my signature. And he had done it while my grandmother was dying in the next room. I drove back to the motel, sat down on the edge of the bed, and opened my laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I started a folder. I named it plainly Vance Ridge, Evidence. Inside it, I placed a screenshot of the deed amendment, a copy of my deployment orders, and a scanned image of the limited power of attorney I had actually signed before leaving, the one that gave my father authority over exactly nothing related to my property. 3 days later, on February 14th, exactly 1 year to the day since I'd deployed, I received a certified letter at the motel. It was from a law office in Austin. Thorne and Whitlock, LLP. Inside was a civil complaint. My father was suing me. The filing claimed that Vance Ridge had been purchased using commingled family funds, that I had abandoned the family estate during a period of medical crisis, and that ownership of the property should be legally transferred, in full, to Garrison Vance. At the bottom of the complaint, in bold, was the name of the attorney representing him. Pierce Thorne. I would later learn he had a reputation across 3 counties for one thing above all else: he never lost a case he could win with theater instead of truth. I sat in that motel room holding the complaint in my hands, and I felt the old training kick in, the same training that had kept me steady in a cockpit with warning lights flashing and a crew depending on me not to panic. I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew could help me build a case my father could never talk his way out of. Not a civilian divorce lawyer. Not a general practice attorney from a strip mall in Killeen. I called the JAG office. Because if my father wanted a fight over paperwork, I was about to show him exactly what 15 years in the United States Army had taught me about paperwork. And what he did not know, sitting in his lawyer's office in Austin planning his opening statement, was that the deployment freeze he thought had made me powerless had actually done something else entirely. It had given me a paper trail he could never explain away. The JAG office at Fort Cavazos wasn't equipped to fight a civil property case, but Captain Renee Okafor, the attorney who'd drafted my original power of attorney before I deployed, sat with me for 2 hours anyway. She read the complaint from Thorne and Whitlock line by line, and around page 4, she stopped and looked up at me. "Valerie," she said, "did you sign a notarized letter in August of last year?" "No," I said. I was on a communication freeze. "I have the deployment logs." She tapped the page. "Because this cites a Bell County Notary Commission number. If that notary actually stamped this, either they were defrauded too, or they're part of the problem. Either way, this isn't just a bad lawsuit. This might be a felony." That sentence sat with me the entire drive back to the motel. I'd spent a year overseas dealing with people who lied to survive, who lied out of fear, who lied because the alternative was worse than the lie itself. I understood that kind of dishonesty. What I didn't yet understand was a man who would forge his own daughter's signature while her grandmother was in hospice down the hall, simply because he wanted her land. I needed to see him. Not to fight. To understand what I was actually up against. I drove to the house in Copper's Cove on February 17th, unannounced, at 9 in the morning. My father answered the door in his robe, coffee in hand, like it was any other Saturday. Behind him, I could see moving boxes stacked in the hallway. Boxes with my handwriting on them. Boxes I had packed 3 years earlier and stored in Vance Ridge's second barn. "Those are mine," I said, nodding past him. "Why are they here?" "I had them moved," he said. "Figured you'd want your things out of the barn since I'm converting it for the cattle operation." I stood on that porch and felt something crack quietly in my chest. Not rage. Something colder. He said it so easily. Like the ranch had already been decided. Like the outcome of a lawsuit that hadn't even reached a courtroom was already settled in his mind, because in his mind, it always had been. "Dad," I said, "you forged my signature." He didn't flinch. He sipped his coffee. I made a decision to protect this family while you were gone playing soldier in a country you can't even name to me. Somebody had to keep this ranch functional. Somebody had to think about your grandmother's care instead of chasing medals. I sent $80,000 home for her care, I said. 4 payments. $20,000 each. Where did that money go, Dad? For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. It was brief, almost nothing, the kind of thing you'd miss if you hadn't spent 15 years reading micro-expressions on pilots who were about to tell you a system was fine when it wasn't. Her care was expensive, he said. Hospice isn't cheap. Ruth had full VA survivor benefits and a supplemental policy that covered 90% of hospice costs, I said. I checked before I deployed. I made sure of it. So where did $80,000 go? He set his coffee down on the porch railing. You need to leave, Valerie. My attorney told me not to discuss the case with you outside of formal proceedings. That was the moment I understood 2 things clearly. First, that Pierce Thorne had already coached him on exactly what not to say, which meant this had been planned for longer than I wanted to believe. Second, that my father was afraid of that exact question, the one about the $80,000, more than he was afraid of anything else I could ask him. I left. But I didn't go back to the motel. I drove straight to a branch of USAA in Killeen, and requested a full transaction history on the joint account I had funded for my grandmother's care, the one my limited power of attorney gave my father narrow, supervised access to. It took the branch manager, a soft-spoken man named Alan Whitfield, 40 minutes to pull 12 months of statements. What I found rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own family. Of the $80,000 I had wired home in 4 installments between March and December of 2023, only $11,000 had gone toward anything resembling my grandmother's medical care. The remaining $69,000 had been transferred, in 5 separate withdrawals, into an account belonging to Vance Cattle Supply, my father's failing business. One withdrawal, dated September 14, 2023, 2 days after my grandmother's funeral, was for $22,000. The memo line, visible right there on the statement, read, Retainer, Thorne and Whitlock. He had used my grandmother's care money I had risked nothing to send home except my own trust, to pay the retainer for the lawyer who was now suing me for my land. 2 days after burying her, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of that USAA branch and I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know some of you are expecting me to say I broke down. I didn't. Something in me went very still and very quiet instead, the same stillness I remember from the cockpit the one time we took small arms fire over a ridge in 2019, and I had for seconds to decide whether to pull up or bank left. You don't panic in that stillness. You calculate. I photographed every page of that statement. I requested certified copies, which Alan was legally able to provide since the account still listed me as primary account holder, and my father only as a limited secondary signer, a detail he apparently hadn't realized when he started moving money through it. I added the certified statements to my evidence folder, right next to the falsified deed amendment. That night, back at the motel, I called Captain Okafor again. There's more, I told her, and read her the numbers. There was a long silence on the line. Valerie, she finally said, this isn't just fraud against you anymore. If he used funds you designated for your grandmother's medical care to pay a lawyer instead, and she subsequently passed while under his direct care, that's something a prosecutor is going to want to look at very closely. I need you to get me everything. Every statement, every deployment log, every communication freeze record. Build the timeline exactly. I spent the next 11 days doing exactly that. I requested my full deployment communication logs from my command, timestamped down to the hour, proving precisely when the freeze began and ended, and proving I was overseas, under lockdown, on August 22, 2023, the day the fraudulent notarized letter claimed I had personally appeared before a Bell County notary. I obtained the housing allowance record showing my basic allowance for housing had also been redirected, without my authorization, into an account linked to my father's business starting in April of 2023, a full 5 months before the deed amendment. That detail stopped me cold. This hadn't started when my grandmother got sick. It had started the moment I left the country. On March 1st, I received a call from Danny Ruiz, the crew chief who'd driven me home that first night. He'd been out at a feed supply store in Copper's Cove, and overheard two men in line ahead of him talking about the Vance property dispute, like it was already common knowledge across 3 counties. One of them mentioned that Garrison had been telling people at the Rotary Club that his daughter had abandoned the family, and that he was simply reclaiming what was rightfully his. My father wasn't just building a legal case. He was building a public narrative. And in a county where everyone knew everyone, where the jury pool would likely include people who'd bought feed from Vance Cattle Supply for 20 years, he was making sure that by the time this reached a courtroom, I would already be the villain in every version of the story except my own. I understood, sitting in that motel room on a Tuesday night in early March, that I could not simply defend myself against a lawsuit. I had to be prepared to dismantle a reputation he had spent weeks constructing, in a room full of people who had already decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. 2 days later, my father's attorney filed a motion requesting an expedited hearing, citing urgent financial hardship caused by what he called my prolonged and unexplained absence from the property. The hearing date was set for October 4th. That gave me 7 months. 7 months to turn a stack of bank statements, deployment logs, and a forged signature into something no judge, no jury, and no smug attorney in an expensive suit could talk their way around. I called Captain Okafor one more time that night and asked her a question I already knew the answer to but needed to hear out loud. Can we get the state prosecutor involved before the civil hearing even starts? There was a pause, and then she said something that changed the entire shape of what was coming. Valerie, I think we're past the point of just defending your property. I think what you actually have here is enough to put your father in a courtroom he never expected to walk into as a defendant. I didn't sleep that night either. But for the first time since I'd stood on my own porch holding a key that no longer fit my own door, it wasn't grief keeping me awake. It was the quiet, methodical satisfaction of watching a plan come together, piece by piece, exactly the way I'd been trained to build one. I drove past Vance Ridge one last time, before heading back to base for a training rotation I couldn't postpone any longer. I didn't stop. I just slowed at the gate long enough to see the new cattle grazing where my garden used to be, the barn lights on at 10 at night, my father's truck parked in the exact spot where mine used to sit. For 3 years, that gravel drive had meant home. Now it felt like enemy territory. I was quietly gathering intelligence on before an operation I hadn't yet named. I thought about Ruth, about the last voice message she'd left me in July of 2023, 4 minutes long, half of it just her telling me about the tomatoes coming in early that year. I hadn't been able to listen to it in months. That night, parked on the shoulder of the county road with my father's ranch shrinking in my rearview mirror, I finally played it again. She sounded tired but happy. She said she was proud of me. She said my father kept telling her I'd forgotten about the family, and she said she didn't believe a word of it. I saved that message to 3 separate devices before I went to sleep that night, because I had a feeling, one I couldn't yet prove, that it was going to matter more than my father understood. What I didn't know yet was that the notary whose commission number appeared on that forged letter was about to reach out to me directly, with a story of her own about the day my father walked into her office alone, holding a document he swore up and down I had already signed. The call came on March 19th, a Tuesday, while I was running a maintenance check on a tail rotor assembly at Fort Cavazos. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number wasn't saved, a local Bell County area code, and I'd been getting enough calls from unknown numbers lately that I'd started assuming most of them were reporters who'd caught wind of the case through the county clerk's office. I answered anyway. Is this Valerie Vance? The voice was a woman's, careful, like she'd rehearsed the sentence before dialing. Speaking. My name is Denise Okafor. No relation to your attorney. I know that's a strange coincidence. I looked her up before I called. I'm a licensed notary public in Bell County. I think you need to hear something about a document with your name on it. I stepped out of the hangar and stood in the Texas heat, with my phone pressed hard against my ear. Denise told me that on August 22, 2023, a man matching my father's description had come into the UPS store where she worked part-time as a notary, holding a document he said needed notarization for a family property matter. She told me he'd been alone. She told me the document had a signature line already filled in with the name Valerie Vance, and that when she asked to see identification for the signer, my father told her the signer had already left, that he was simply dropping off the paperwork on her behalf, and that he had power of attorney to handle it. I made a mistake, Denise said, and her voice cracked slightly. I was covering 2 registers that day, and I was rushed, and I notarized based on his representation instead of requiring the signer to appear in person, which is a violation of my duties. I've been sick about it for months. Then 2 weeks ago a woman from the county clerk's office mentioned your case to my supervisor, just as gossip, nothing official, and I put it together. I need to make this right before this gets worse for me and for you. I asked her if she'd be willing to put that in a sworn statement. I already contacted an attorney of my own, she said. He told me the same thing. If I don't get ahead of this, I could lose my commission and face charges myself for improper notarization. I'd rather come forward. I called Captain Okafor the second I hung up with Denise. Within 4 days, we had a notarized affidavit from Denise Okafor stating, under penalty of perjury, that Garrison Vance had presented a document for notarization without the actual signer present, and that he had specifically represented to her that he held power of attorney authorizing him to submit the paperwork on my behalf. That single sworn statement did 3 things at once. It proved the letter was fraudulent. It proved my father had actively deceived a notary public to get it stamped. And it established, in his own words to a third party, that he knew he needed legal authorization he did not actually have. I added the affidavit to the folder. It was getting thick now, organized in labeled tabs the way I organized pre-flight checklists, because I'd learned a long time ago that disorganized evidence is worse than no evidence at all in front of a judge with limited patience. With the hearing set for October 4th, Captain Okafor connected me with a civilian attorney who specialized in property and elder fraud litigation, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Raman out of Austin, since JAG's role was limited to advising, not representing me in a civil matter. Priya read through everything in a single sitting at her office on April 2nd, then leaned back in her chair and said something I still think about. Your father's attorney is going to try to make this about your absence, she said. He's going to paint you as cold, as career-obsessed, as a woman who chose a uniform over her own grandmother. That's his entire strategy, because on the actual facts, he has nothing. So our strategy is simple. We let him talk. We let him build that narrative in front of the jury pool. And then we take it apart, piece by piece, with paper he can't argue with. Priya wanted more. She wanted a complete financial reconstruction, not just of the $80,000 I'd sent home, but of Vance Cattle Supply's full financial history, to establish a pattern rather than a single incident. She filed a discovery request in early May demanding my father's business records for the prior 3 years. Pierce Thorne fought it for 6 weeks, filing 3 separate motions to limit the scope, which Priya said told her everything she needed to know. Innocent people don't fight this hard to keep their books closed, she told me on a call in late June. The records finally came through in July, under court order, after Judge Evelyn Sterling, the judge assigned to our case, personally overruled Thorne's third objection and warned him from the bench that further delay tactics would be viewed unfavorably. That was the first time I heard her name. I didn't know yet that she'd built a reputation across the Central Texas Judicial District as a judge with almost no tolerance for courtroom theater, and even less for anyone who tried to weaponize a service member's deployment against them. Her younger brother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Priya found that detail through public record searches of past rulings, not as something to exploit, she was careful to tell me, but as reassurance that whoever sat on that bench would understand exactly what a deployment freeze actually meant. What the business records revealed, once our forensic accountant, a meticulous man named Harold Byrne who'd spent 20 years auditing agricultural businesses across 3 counties, finished combing through them, was worse than I'd expected. Vance Cattle Supply had been operating at a loss since 2019. By early 2023, before I'd even deployed, my father was 6 months behind on a business loan with First Central Bank of Texas, facing a default notice dated January 30, 2023, just 2 weeks before I left the country. Harold found that the $69,000 diverted from my grandmother's care account hadn't just paid Thorne's retainer. It had also covered 2 overdue loan payments, made on April 18 and July 11 of 2023, keeping Garrison's business technically solvent right through the exact window when he was quietly building the case to take my land. He hadn't stolen from a dying woman out of desperation in a single reckless moment. He had planned it, month by month, using her care as a slush fund to keep his own failing business alive, while I was 7,000 miles away trusting him completely. In August, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. My father's sister, my Aunt Colleen, who I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years after a falling out over an unrelated family matter, reached out through a mutual cousin. She wanted to meet. I was cautious. Priya was more cautious. But I agreed to a coffee meeting at a diner off Highway 190 on August 14. Colleen told me she'd overheard my father on the phone with Pierce Thorne back in June, discussing what she described as cleaning up the paper trail before October. She hadn't understood the full context at the time. She'd assumed it was ordinary legal preparation. But after hearing through the family grapevine about the notary's affidavit and the frozen business records, she'd started putting pieces together that troubled her enough to come forward. She agreed to speak with Priya. What she eventually confirmed, in a signed statement dated August 22, exactly 1 year to the day after the forged letter had been notarized, was that she'd personally heard my father say the words, "She'll be too tired from that deployment to fight it, and even if she does, no jury around here is going to side against me over some soldier who was never even home." Colleen also confirmed that she had, on 2 separate occasions in 2023, heard my father refer to the $80,000 I'd sent for Ruth's care as the ranch fund, not medical money, but ranch money, months before he ever filed anything in court. By September, Priya and I had built something I genuinely believed no jury, and certainly no judge as sharp as Evelyn Sterling was reported to be, could dismantle. A forged letter. A notary's sworn recantation. A forensic accounting trail showing exactly where the diverted funds went and when. A sister's signed statement quoting my father's own words about his strategy. Deployment logs proving, to the hour, that I was under lockdown on the exact date he claimed I'd personally appeared to sign paperwork in Texas. But Pierce Thorne wasn't finished either. On September 20, just 2 weeks before the hearing, he filed an amended witness list. Near the bottom, one name stopped me cold, a name I hadn't seen or spoken to in almost a decade. Marcus Whitfield. My ex-fiancé, from before I ever bought Vance Ridge, a man I hadn't spoken to since our engagement ended badly in 2019, listed by my father's attorney as a character witness prepared to testify about my emotional instability and history of prioritizing career over relationships. I sat in Priya's office reading that name over and over, trying to understand how my father had even found him, let alone convinced him to testify against me. Priya set down the witness list, looked at me steadily, and said the words that told me exactly how far Garrison Vance was willing to go. "He's not just trying to win the property anymore," she said. "He's trying to destroy your credibility so completely that even if we win on the paperwork, the jury pool walks out of that courtroom believing you're exactly the kind of daughter who deserved to lose her home." I had 2 weeks to figure out why Marcus Whitfield, a man who hadn't spoken to me in 5 years, was suddenly willing to stand up in a Bell County courtroom and lie about who I really was. I found Marcus Whitfield's address through a mutual friend from my old unit, and I drove to Waco on September 25, 9 days before the hearing, against Priya's advice. She wanted to handle it through formal channels, a deposition, something on the record. I wanted to look him in the eye first. He answered the door looking older than I remembered, a little heavier, a wedding ring on his hand that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked tired, the way people look when they've been carrying something they didn't want. "Your dad called me in July," he said, before I'd even said hello. "Said you were trying to steal a piece of land from your own family while your grandmother was dying. Said he needed someone who knew the real you to set the record straight. And you believed him." I didn't know what to believe, Marcus said. It's been 5 years, Valerie. I don't actually know who you are anymore. But he made it sound like a favor. Like I'd just be telling the truth about how things ended between us. How did things end between us, Marcus? He was quiet for a long moment. You chose your career over me. That's the truth as far as I understood it back then. I chose 15 years of federal service to my country over a relationship where you asked me to turn down a promotion so you wouldn't feel threatened, I said. That's also true. Both of those things happened. My father wants you to tell a jury the first version and leave out the second. I didn't ask him to lie for me. I asked him one question. Are you willing to testify to something you know isn't the complete truth, to help a man take a ranch from the daughter he forged documents against while she was overseas? Marcus didn't testify. He called Priya's office on October 1st and withdrew from the witness list, telling her, on record, exactly what my father had asked of him, and why he'd changed his mind. Piers Thorne lost his character witness 3 days before trial. I later learned from Colleen that my father was furious when he found out that he'd called Marcus twice trying to talk him back into it, and that Marcus never picked up. The hearing began on the morning of October 4, 2024, in Courtroom 3 of the Bell County Courthouse, before Judge Evelyn Sterling. I wore my army dress uniform, not for effect, but because Priya said the jury pool needed to see exactly who they were being asked to believe abandoned her family, rather than let my father's version stand unchallenged in their minds before I'd said a single word. My father arrived with Piers Thorne at his side, wearing a gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly base pay, greeting people in the gallery like he was hosting the event rather than defending fraud. He looked at me once, briefly, and smiled, the same smile he'd given me at Thanksgiving dinners for 30 years. I didn't smile back. I sat with my black folder in my lap and I waited. Thorne opened first. He told the jury a story about a devoted father who'd sacrificed everything to hold his family together while his daughter was, in his words, chasing glory overseas, about a grieving man who'd simply tried to protect a property that family funds had helped build, about a soldier so emotionally hardened by combat that she'd missed her own grandmother's final months without so much as a phone call. He painted my silence in the courtroom, the silence Priya had specifically instructed me to maintain, as guilt. He gestured toward my father, who dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief on cue, and the gallery, just as my father had predicted, nodded along. That was when my father leaned toward me during a brief recess, and whispered the words I opened this story with. You're wrong, foolish soldier. You built it but I own it. He laughed, quiet enough that only I could hear it, convinced the performance had already worked. When Judge Sterling called for the defense to respond, Priya didn't stand up and deliver a speech. She stood, said simply, the defense would like to enter physical evidence into the record, and I stepped forward and handed the bailiff the black folder. Judge Sterling reviewed it in near silence for what felt like a very long time. She looked at the certified deployment logs proving I was under a communication freeze on August 22, 2023, the exact date the forged letter claimed I had appeared before a notary. She looked at Denise Okafor's sworn affidavit describing my father's deception. She looked at Harold Byrne's forensic accounting, laying out, dollar by dollar, exactly how $69,000 of the $80,000 I'd sent for my grandmother's care had been funneled into keeping Vance cattle supply out of default and into paying Piers Thorne's own retainer. She looked at Aunt Colleen's signed statement, quoting my father's own words about waiting until I was too tired from that deployment to fight it. Denise Okafor took the stand next and testified in person, describing, in a steady but visibly emotional voice, the day my father walked into her office alone, and told her the signer had already left. Under cross-examination, Thorne tried to suggest she was covering for her own notarial error by inventing a story about my father. She looked directly at the jury and said she had already reported the incident to the Texas Secretary of State's office before she ever spoke to me, a filing that existed independently, with its own timestamp, well before any conversation between us. Then Harold Byrne walked the jury through the numbers, slowly, methodically, showing the loan default notice from January 2023, the 2 loan payments made in April and July that matched, dollar for dollar, withdrawals from the account meant for my grandmother's hospice care, and the $22,000 retainer payment to Thorne's own firm, made 2 days after Ruth's funeral. I watched my father's face change throughout the morning. The confidence drained out of it slowly, replaced by something tighter, angrier, the look of a man watching a story he'd spent a year constructing come apart in front of the exact audience he'd built it for. Judge Sterling called a recess at noon. When court resumed at 1:30, she didn't wait for closing arguments. She addressed my father directly from the bench, and the courtroom went completely silent. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I have spent the last hour reviewing certified military records, a licensed notary's sworn affidavit and independent state filing, forensic financial analysis, and a signed witness statement, all of which corroborate each other without contradiction. Your daughter was under a federal communication freeze, verified by her command, on the exact date you claim she personally appeared before a notary in this county. You diverted funds designated for your mother's end-of-life medical care into your own failing business, and into your own attorney's retainer. And you did so while representing to a jury pool, before this trial even began, that your daughter was the one who abandoned this family." She took off her glasses. "Mr. Vance, you didn't just try to exploit a landlord. You committed felony federal fraud against a deployed United States officer, and you attempted to compound that fraud through perjured testimony in my courtroom." The gavel came down hard enough that I felt it in my chest. Judge Sterling dismissed the civil complaint in its entirety, ruled Vance Ridge to be my sole, uncontested property, and ordered my father to vacate the premises within 72 hours, remove all cattle and equipment at his own expense, and pay 100% of my legal fees, totaling just over $41,000. She then instructed the court clerk to forward the complete evidentiary record to the Bell County District Attorney's Office for review of criminal perjury and fraud charges. My father sat frozen in his chair, pale, his hands flat on the table in front of him like he was trying to hold himself upright. Pierce Thorne closed his briefcase without looking at him, said something quiet to the judge about withdrawing as counsel of record, and walked out of the courtroom before the gallery had even finished processing what had happened. I didn't gloat. I didn't look at my father again. I gathered my folder, thanked Priya, and walked out into the October sunlight, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe without something pressing against my ribs. 72 hours later, on October 7th, I drove out to Vance Ridge, and watched a livestock transport company load the last of my father's cattle off my land. The steel gate he'd installed came down that same afternoon. I stood in the driveway as the trucks pulled away, and Danny Ruiz, who'd shown up unannounced with a cooler of drinks and 2 folding chairs, sat down next to me on the tailgate of his truck without saying a word, because some things don't need commentary. The Bell County District Attorney's Office filed formal charges against my father in December, 2 counts of financial exploitation of an elderly person and 1 count of forgery, built almost entirely on the record Priya, Harold, Denise, and Colleen had helped me assemble. I testified once more in a smaller room, in front of a grand jury, and then I stepped back, and let the system I'd spent 15 years defending handle the rest. I never got my $69,000 back in full. Restitution takes time, and some of it, I've accepted, I may never see. But that was never really what this was about. What I got back was Vance Ridge, quiet and mine, the creek still running cold in the mornings, the tin roof still holding up against the Texas wind. I sit on that porch most evenings now, coffee in hand, and sometimes I play Ruth's old voicemail, the one about the tomatoes, just to hear her voice say she was proud of me. My father is somewhere in Bell County right now, facing a sentencing hearing in the spring, and I've made my peace with whatever the court decides is fair, because that decision was never really mine to carry. I flew back overseas for a short assignment in January of this year, 6 weeks, routine, uneventful. And when I came home this time, the key turned smoothly in the lock, exactly the way it should, exactly the way it always should have. Some people ask me if I forgive him. I tell them the truth. I don't know yet. But I know this much for certain. He called me a foolish soldier in a courtroom full of people who believed him, and by the time the judge brought her gavel down, every single one of them understood exactly which one of us had actually built something worth defending.